Admiral Richard Byrd appears to have lost an epic battle at the South Pole in 1947. Stopping in Chile on his way back to the United States from Operation High Jump, he made several startling statements concerning new flying craft that could fly from pole to pole in moments. Once the Americans realized that the Germans had a secret base in Antarctica, and they also possessed new flying craft and super weapons, they decided to create an alliance with the Germans.
High jump, you're clearly looking at the discovery of something that was much greater and much more fearsome than the U.S. had been aware of.
Reinhard Gehlen was head of intelligence armies east for the Nazis, combat troops, and as they took over larger and larger swaths of Russia, he picked up the anti-communist underground that was there and then turned them into his Gehlen organization.
Reinhard Gehlen was an SS general, and he was actually head of the eastern forces of the SS, and so he was an intelligence expert on the Russians and the Russian military for the Germans. At the end of World War II, Reinhard Gehlen was able to surrender to the British and the Americans, who gladly took him in as an intelligence partner. Reinhard Gehlen was certainly one of the most knowledgeable people in the Third Reich on intelligence matters, and involving, of course, Germany, but also the Russians as well.
At the end of the war, he had whole trainloads of files and information on anti-communist activities in Russia. So he came to the Allies, the Americans particularly, and he said, look, you guys are going to be facing the Russians. You don't know anything about them. They've been infiltrating spies into the United States since the World War I, and said, but I have all the information, and if you'll let me provide the information, I can give you the intelligence you need to combat the Soviets. And they did. The deal was cut.
And the United States government basically took Gehlen and made him really an OSS officer and later as a CIA asset in a sense.
He had two qualifications at least. One of them, he said, don't ask me to provide any intelligence that might harm my home country, my fatherland, okay, which shows he was an unreconstructed Nazi, okay. And two, he said, if there becomes a intelligence service in Germany again, I want to be the head of it. And sure enough, he became head of West German intelligence. Now, the key to all this is, and the meaning is really pretty incredible. Because what this means is that after World War II, immediately after World War II, and going into the Cold War, the information we were getting out of Russia was coming from an anti-communist underground filtered to a Nazi organization. No wonder we had the Cold War. No wonder we thought Russia was trying to take over the world. It's amazing.
It was through Reinhard Gehlen that the Americans were able to engineer what was called Project Paperclip. And that was to bring all of these Nazi scientists, particularly aerospace and other technicians, rocket scientists and stuff, and people who worked at Peenemünde, including Wernher von Braun, to the United States.
What we know for sure is at the end of the Second World War, that the British, the Americans, and the Russians essentially grabbed as much material as they could, and also the scientists. For example, the US had Operation Paperclip, which was designed to bring as many Nazi scientists over to the US to continue the rocket-based programs out at the White Sands missile range, as it's called today. It used to be called the White Sands Proving Ground. Many of the German scientists were sent there, where they worked on essentially the German V-2 rocket. It was just a continuation. And of course, one of those was Wernher von Braun, who became one of the leading figures in NASA later on. So in other words, we've got this paper trail and people trail as well, going from Nazi Germany through Paperclip, right through NASA, through the 60s and 70s, and all interconnected.
One thing that people have to realize, too, is that as the war was lost by the Germans, the British and the Russians, because of the vicious fighting that they had been in, there wasn't really a way that the British, say, could bring a bunch of Nazi scientists to Britain and have them work in the British space program. That just wouldn't have flown, shall we say. But with the largesse of the United States and America's friendly relationships, really, with Germans and other Europeans, the United States was able to bring in these scientists, these Nazi scientists, without a lot of hullabaloo or questioning. And even within the military, there wasn't some big opposition to bringing these Nazi scientists to the U.S. And that's what Paperclip was really all about.
Now, the people who were working in the U.S. defense community thought that they had the might and the willpower to be able to smash out the Germans, when in fact the other is what took place. The Germans were more cunning, they were more ruthless, and because all this was done under the cloak of secrecy, they could gain control over this military-industrial complex, and nobody out there in the open would ever know anything about it. What are they going to do? Complain? Oh yeah, the Germans took over all this secret stuff that we haven't told you that we have. There was nothing they could do. The Germans took over, and it's all remained classified right up until the present.
Most of these Nazi scientists ended up in aerospace in one way or another, even working for NASA, and they worked in New Mexico, at Alamogordo, and at Roswell. Ultimately, in the end, Werner von Braun, a paperclip scientist, became the head of NASA and the director of it. And Americans just accepted that without question, really.
Near Roswell, New Mexico, where German paperclip scientists were working on top-secret military aircraft and rockets, an event occurred on July 8, 1947, that would change everything. Rancher Mac Brazel, while searching for missing cattle, finds wreckage of a flying craft strewn over a vast swath of his property. He also claimed to have seen bodies of strange humanoids that had been hurt in the crash. What really happened at Roswell?
The question of what happened at Roswell had been asked me since I became the first civilian investigator of the Roswell incident way back in the 70s, mind you. And I'm still convinced, and there's a lot more work now available than was then, that an intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft crashed. I won't say landed, I say crashed. It didn't just come down gently and let's see where we are, folks, or anything like that. I believe there was a mid-air collision. In my first conversation with Major Jesse Marcel, who was the intelligence officer at the base, Jesse told me, he's talking about all this strange wreckage spread out over this area, 3/4 of a mile long, 1/4 mile wide. Like, he'd seen crashes in the war in the Pacific. Usually there's a big hole in the ground when the airplane blows up, He said he thought there had to be a mid-air explosion for two reasons. The wreckage was spread over such a large area. There was nothing conventional, no hole in the ground, and how could it be dispersed if you had a crash?
Many researchers believe that an alien craft crashed at Roswell. But is there another explanation?
When people look at the whole Roswell crash and everything, there's some serious problems about that being some alien or extraterrestrial craft. First of all, Roswell is not just some ordinary town in America. Roswell is an Air Force base. It's Alamogordo. It's the Trinity nuclear site. It was the base of the only atomic bomb squadron in the world.
Some researchers have suggested that the Roswell incident may well have been connected to some of these early advanced terrestrial technologies. For example, Joseph Farrell, I mean, he's looked into that issue very deeply, the idea that perhaps what crashed was a German device, not necessarily one that we captured and we were sort of trying to understand it, but possibly the last sort of vestiges of almost like a final Third Reich or a Fourth Reich that was trying to build up. And we kind of stumbled onto the existence of this new order, so to speak, when the wreckage was found.
Roswell, it was really the Area 51 of the 40s and early 50s. The idea that some craft is crashing at Roswell, and this is a town now crawling with German aerospace scientists and people who are working with Mercury. They were allegedly developing flying saucers and the Bell and other things like that in Germany at the end of the war. And so the idea that they're experimenting themselves on these craft, it makes complete sense. And that some of their own experimental craft would fail and crash, as it happens when you're experimenting with anything, really, and aerospace particularly. Not everything's gonna work right the first time. You're gonna have crashes.
They all had a philosophical and a psychological commitment to it. I mean, when you join the SS, they tattooed your SS number into your skin because you were supposed to wear it forever. I mean, they didn't stop being Nazis.
I wrote a book on this sort of subject myself back in 2005 called Body Snatchers in the Desert, which also looked at the idea of experiments out in New Mexico using human subjects in high-altitude experiments. And I wouldn't be at all surprised, it wouldn't shock me at all, if Roswell did turn out to be like somebody's dirty little secret, which in many respects could be far more dangerous, if you like, and devastating than the idea that aliens crashed. You know, the idea of using human subjects, possibly against their will, in test flights of radical aircraft and things like that. I think that's something that really would, next to the UFO issue, that's the one thing I think more than any other that would guarantee total silence. We can never let this story out because of how it would make, certain people look. Because, paperclip itself was controversial enough, doing a deal with Nazi scientists, but it was kind of like one of those Faustian pacts, doing a deal with the devil, because had we not done it, had the Brits not done it, the Russians would have got all of them, and they probably would have got far more ahead of us at a greater pace. And for all we know, 1953, 1954, we could have seen ourselves nuked, and Russia running the planet today, or what would be left of it.
You would think, really, that the Roswell crash, and almost any UFO crash at that time, or in the United States, or perhaps even in Mexico or something, would really be a craft that was being built, perhaps in Roswell, or Alamogordo, or somewhere else.
When it comes to Roswell, the big stumbling block in terms of suggesting that it was a terrestrial craft, for a lot of people at least, is the nature of the bodies. We know there was a great deal of testing of rocketry and strange aircraft going on in New Mexico in 45, 46, 47. If somebody found, like the rancher Matt Brazel on the Foster Ranch in July 47, if he found unusual wreckage, then that could go either way. That it could be ours, it could be theirs, it could be some Russian reconnaissance plane that came down. But the bodies are the one thing that really kind of convinced a lot of people that what they were seeing were extraterrestrials, because people talked about these small bodies with large heads and wearing sort of, almost like a flight suit kind of thing. And it's difficult to suggest what they might have been had they not been, say, American pilots or Russian pilots.
These people were ideologues, and that they were consumed by their Nazi ideology and their vision of a Fourth Reich and their commitment to eugenics and genocide and the horrible things that they did. There was a guy who wrote an article in Sega in the mid-70s, and he had put into the article a series of icons that had been seen on UFOs. And if you look at the iconography, it's filled with fascist iconography. One of them is from a fascist Italian aircraft squadron. There's the Wolfschlägel. There's it's like an F. There's a symbol from the British Union of Fascists. I mean, it's just all over it. We paint icons on everything, right? We have to categorize things, and we put icons on them so that we understand what they were. I mean, even chevrons, which you would see on a Luftwaffe aircraft to denote the rank of the person flying it, it's all there.
I think when we look at the entire time frame of 44, 45 through the late 40s, early 50s, we can make a very plausible case for the hand of our technology. And maybe, some of the stories about alien UFOs were actually spread to confuse the real story. Everybody's chasing aliens, and the real picture gets buried even deeper. One of the things I found was that the Japanese had done some sort of very bizarre experiments, sort of biological warfare and chemical warfare, not just on prisoners of war, but on handicapped people, including dwarfs. And also the Nazis, for example, Joseph Mengele, one of the sort of the most craziest Dr. Frankenstein types on the planet, he had an obsession with dwarfs and dwarfism. And there are a lot of rumours and stories about some of these handicapped people, including dwarfs, being taken from hospitals, asylums, because back then there was a great deal of stigma concerning people who unfortunately had physical handicaps. It's not like today, they were sort of locked away. It was the member of the family nobody talks about, that kind of thing. And there are a lot of rumours and stories about people being taken from such places where they wouldn't be missed because nobody cares about them, and using some of them physically handicapped people, including dwarfs, and that you only need one of these craft to come down, or some sort of high altitude balloon with a gondola, and there's all this sort of foil from the balloon on the ground and these small bodies strewn around. You can quite easily see how 30 years later, when all the guys who are involved are interviewed, you can easily see how that could mutate into a crashed UFO legend. They wouldn't be lying. A lot of those guys may have been on guard duty at the site. They might have been 30 feet away, but they were close enough to see the wreckage and the material on the ground, and they were close enough to see these small bodies. 30 years later, when everybody's talking about UFOs, oh, well, that's what they were. But they may not have been, And again, something like that, taking people from prisons, from hospitals, that would be, again, a major sort of black mark, if you like, in the history of the Cold War. And again, another valid reason to keep it not just hidden, but bury it just about as far as you can.
It was only once they went to Antarctica and found out what was really going on that they realized that the World War II has not ended. It's actually very serious, it's still ongoing, and they better be prepared to fight back. So what do they do to fight back? They start building up the national security state. This is where you have the OSS, or Office of Strategic Services, becoming transformed into the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA. You have a much greater bureaucratic, secret structure.
1947 was a very interesting year. It was the year which gave birth to the flying saucer, when Kenneth Arnold had his encounter with a squadron of flying saucers, flying discs over Mount Rainier on June 24, 1947. And the media immediately latched onto this all around the world. Flying discs, as they were also known back then, and flying saucers became big news. You know, was it the Russians? Is it us? Are the Martians invaded? These are all the kind of things that came out, and in no time at all, you know, there were UFO groups set up. 1947, coincidentally or not, you know, was also the year we had the passing of the National Security Act. We had the first Secretary of Defense, which was James Forrestal. The CIA was created in 1947, and weird things are flying around in the sky throughout this entire era. So I have to wonder deeply if a lot of this was in response to the presence of the UFO phenomenon. And there's a reason why I think that could indeed be the case, because if you look at the history of the phenomenon, the UFO phenomenon in 1947 basically came out of nowhere. The government of the day, regardless of whether they're extraterrestrial, military test vehicles, or a combination of the two, the government seemed totally puzzled by it and concerned, because something's flying around and we don't know what it is. And so they'd never experienced something like this before, because they're not necessarily attacking us, they're not helping us, they're just skulking around and we cannot stop them, we don't know who they are. So I can easily see how somebody said, we've got to do something about this quickly. We need to set up programs, we need to initiate a military response if anything happens.
The American commitment to this new alliance was shaky at best. There were many insiders who disagreed with Truman's decision to bring into the United States German scientists and military personnel. In the summer of 1952, the residents of Washington, D.C. watched helplessly as a squadron of UFOs flew over the most sensitive areas of U.S. government facilities.
The great UFO flap of 1952. I think that was somebody flexing their muscle. I think that somebody had decided that they needed to show the U.S. government that we're around and we're upset, or we're around and we have this capability. So they sent a squadron of Hounaboo maybe and buzzed the U.S. Capitol.
We can say that the recent sightings are in no way connected with any secret development by any agency of the United States.
All of this sudden change in 47, I think there's a very strong case can be put forward that it was due to the sudden presence of the UFO phenomenon.
We can see that when one investigates the Roswell crash, we discover a labyrinth of lies and deception. Perhaps the truth will never come out. But what if the Germans are more involved in flying saucer stories than we've been led to believe? In 1961, Betty and Barney Hill had a strange occurrence. Driving home late one night, they witnessed a UFO following them. Later, they discovered that they were missing many hours of time during this late-night drive. Under hypnosis, the couple began to recall that the occupants of the flying saucer had abducted them. This story has become legend in UFO circles. Many researchers believe aliens had abducted the couple. But what if there's another explanation for the Betty and Barney Hill incident?
So there's a very interesting thing about Betty and Barney Hill. It's not often discussed. In a lot of ways, it's actually suppressed, I would suggest to you. But if you actually look at their testimony and you see what they said when they were regressed, they talk about coming aboard the ship. You know, obviously they had seen the ship land. Barney had gotten out of the car. He drew his .45 military issue, as he had been in the Army. He fired at it, right? And then somehow they overwhelmed him, and they got him aboard the craft with his wife. So they come aboard the ship, and if you look at the actual testimony, they were greeted by a red-headed Irishman. Now, red-headed Irishman went around and introduced them to a bunch of tall people that they said Barney Hill thought were speaking German. And he described their uniforms as having silver piping, and peaked caps, which is similar to an SS Panzer uniform. They had silver piping, and then they would wear a peaked cap. And he said that it reminded him of Nazis. There was like a German shepherd there that was staying near the red-headed Irishman. Now, what's interesting about that is that during World War II, the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, was actually partially financed by the Germans. The Nazis, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so the Nazis and the IRA both disliked England with a passion, so the Nazis had equipment and training, and they gave it to the IRA. It's also not widely known, but there was a legion of Irish soldiers that fought in the SS. So there was definitely communication there. And if you're going to leave town and go somewhere else, other people of your interest, right, people who share your ideology, are going to come with you. So I would expect that if the Nazis did indeed have a saucer program, Hanabus are real, and they left, you would see Irish people, you would see Italians, you would see some Scandinavians who had collaborated, some French, the Vichy French. You would see all these people, and it's one of those interesting things that when you come back away from it, you start to see those people.
The Germans and the Americans succeeded in their efforts to make flying craft that could go into space. Perhaps they also used aliens as a cover story for their research. But did they create a breakaway civilization with this advanced technology?
So when I think of this particular group, this black budget group that's got access to what I believe is extraterrestrial technology, I look at them as a separate civilization, one that is broken away from our own, hence the term breakaway civilization.
Imagine what it would be like for the Germans to develop space travel, to actually be able to leave the Earth in these Bellcraft, to then go to some place like the Moon or like Mars, and to discover that there are ruins that are already there, highly technological, just sitting there empty, waiting to be reoccupied. All you have to do is build doors, pressurize it, add an atmosphere, and you now have a place that you can develop, you can industrialize, you can plan, you can bring people up to for staff, and there is no possible way that anyone on Earth could ever find out where you are, could ever invade, as long as they also do not possess space travel technology.
I would say the odds are excellent that we're expanding out into the solar system. I think they started with the Moon because it's close. I think after the Moon they went to Mars. There's plenty of evidence of installations on the Moon and Mars. Once you have the capability to get to Mars, you pretty much have the capability to get to anywhere.
So even in Antarctica, the Germans are still vulnerable. Operation High Jump was a whole naval fleet with all kinds of war materials going in there. Now, granted, at the time, the Germans had the defense advantage because they had the Bellcraft and the U.S. did not. But what happens once the U.S. develops their own version of the Bellcraft? Those Bellcraft from the German side could be shot down, their bases could be invaded, and they could be conquered. Nobody's going to be able to conquer you if you're off-planet. You can build machines that are highly classified and know for a fact that nobody on Earth could ever gain possession of them because you don't ever intend on bringing them to Earth.
I think that they are about to achieve, if they have not already achieved, significant artificial intelligence. And I do believe that they are much more advanced with quantum computing than we're led to believe.
I think that they started to expand. And I think that we can see the leftover traces. As humans, we're not very clean and subtle. When you look at the moon, you can see tracks on the moon of vehicles moving around. In one case, you can see the vehicle itself. On the moon, you can find installations if you know where to look. And I think that they executed a program to cover it up, whether it's the notion of Kubrick faking the moon landing, or whether it's probes crashing into Mars because we can't set the altimeter correctly.
And so you would work through, have organizations like NASA as your cover, and then you would work through the DoD, which would also be your cover for something even more clandestine. I think this is exactly what has happened.
So the Germans had the decisive advantage of being able to continue their massive military industrial expansion far away from where there could be any interference from people on Earth.
The United States government and military formed an alliance with the Germans. This gave them a huge boost to the research due to the vast resources of the United States. Through the 1950s and 1960s, great strides were taken in this research. There seemed to be a goal of getting off the planet. Perhaps they feared an imminent catastrophe, or maybe they just wanted to see if they could do it. We'll see in our next episode that they did succeed in getting into space through their discoveries of various forms of anti-gravity.
Communist activities in Russia. So he came to the Allies, the Americans particularly, and he said, look, you guys are going to be facing the Russians. You don't know anything about them. They've been infiltrating spies into the United States since the World War I, and said, but I have all the information, and if you will let me provide the information, I can give you the intelligence you need to combat the Soviets. And they did. The deal was cut.
And the United States government basically took Gellin and made him really an OSS officer and later as a CIA asset in a sense.
He had two qualifications at least. One of them, he said,
SS. And so he was an intelligence expert on the Russians and the Russian military for the Germans. At the end of World War II, Reinhard Gellin was able to surrender to the British and the Americans, who gladly took him in as an intelligence partner. Reinhard Gellin was certainly one of the most knowledgeable people in the Third Reich on intelligence matters, and involving, of course, Germany, but also of the Russians as well.
At the end of the war, he had whole trainloads of files and information on anti.
Admiral Richard Byrd appears to have lost an epic battle at the South Pole in 1947. Stopping in Chile on his way back to the United States from Operation High Jump, he made several startling statements concerning new flying craft that could fly from pole to pole in moments. Once the Americans realized that the Germans had a secret base in Antarctica, and they also possessed new flying craft and super weapons, they decided to create an alliance with the Germans.
High jump, you're clearly looking at the discovery of something that was much greater and much more fearsome than the U.S. had been aware of.
Reinhard Gellin was head of intelligence armies east for the Nazis, combat troops, and as they took over larger and larger swaths of Russia, he picked up the anti-communist underground that was there and then turned them into his Gellin organization.
Reinhard Gehlen was an SS general, and he was actually head of the Eastern forces of the...
Don't ask me to provide any intelligence that might harm my home country, my fatherland, okay, which shows he was an unreconstructed Nazi, okay. And two, he said, if there becomes a intelligence service in Germany again, I want to be the head of it. And sure enough, he became head of West German intelligence. Now, the key to all this is, the meaning is really pretty incredible. Because what this means is that after World War II, immediately after World War II, and going into the Cold War, the information we were getting out of Russia was coming from an anti-communist underground filtered to a Nazi organization. No wonder we had the Cold War. No wonder we thought Russia was trying to